All right, so we are diving into a case today that I'm sure you've heard of, but trust me, the source material we're going through today really adds layers to the Menendez brothers' story that make it even more fascinating than it already is.
Yeah, it really is a case study in conflicting narratives, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Mm.
I mean, just to refresh everyone's memory, we're talking Beverly Hills, 1989. Lyle and Eric Menendez are accused of brutally murdering their parents, Jose and Kitty, and it was a huge deal at the time.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting. The source material focuses on how the case was presented, how it became this sprawling exploration of what truth even means in a courtroom.
Exactly. And it reminds me of how the series Dahmer really got people thinking about the nature versus nurture debate when it comes to violent crime. And this source material seems to be asking a similar question about the Menendez brothers. Were they destined to commit such a horrific act, or did their environment, their alleged history of abuse, plant the seeds of violence?
Right. And speaking of that alleged abuse, their defense was incredibly controversial at the time. They claimed years of sexual and psychological abuse at the hands of their father, with their mother sadly participating.
And this is where the case transcends the typical true crime story. This defense, while shocking to many at the time, really put a spotlight on the often silenced issue of male victims of abuse. Remember, this was 1989, long before conversations about these topics were as open as they are today.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of wealth and privilege in Beverly Hills, a brutal crime, and then this explosive defense that forces everyone to confront an uncomfortable possibility. And to make it even more complex, the source material points out that the Netflix series about the case really leaned into the unreliable narrator trope, presenting each episode through a different lens.
It's a fascinating approach, structurally speaking.
Yeah.
By shifting perspectives constantly, the brothers, the lawyers, witnesses the series, almost makes it impossible for the viewer to land on a definitive truth. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing.
And then you've got these details from the source material that further complicate the picture. For example, after the murders, the brothers went on a massive spending spree, like almost $700,000 on designer clothes, watches, even a Porsche. Doesn't exactly scream traumatized victims, does it?
It's a detail that, according to the source, had a huge impact on public perception. It fed into this narrative of spoiled rich kids who thought they were above the law.
And that takes us deeper into the legal weeds, right? Because if public perception was already skewed, how could the brothers possibly get a fair shake in court?
That's where things get really interesting because the source argues that the series glossed over some significant external evidence that might have added more nuance to the brothers' claims of abuse.
Okay, so we're talking about potentially crucial evidence being left out. This feels like a good time to unpack that a bit more.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence are we talking about, and why does the source find it so important?
Well, one example is this letter that Eric wrote to his cousin before the murders. This wasn't just some passing comment or anything. It was a detailed account of his fear and anxiety about his father. And the source argues that this letter, which was public record, by the way, could have lent more weight to their claims of a hostile and dangerous home environment.
And it's not just the letter, right? The
Mhm.
source also mentions this guy, Roy Rossello, who is a friend of the family. What's his connection to all of this?
Yeah, so Russell actually came forward during the trial with these allegations that Jose Menendez had sexually abused him for years, starting when he was just a teenager.
Wow, and that's huge, right? Because it provides potential corroboration to the brothers' claims.
Exactly. If their father had a history of abuse, it makes their defense more plausible, right?
So we have this external evidence that seems to support at least part of the brothers' story. But the Netflix series, according to the source, doesn't really address it. Why is that omission so crucial?
Because it plays directly into that question of truth that we keep bumping up against in this case. By leaving out these details, the source argues the series misses a huge opportunity to delve into the complexities of abuse and its impact on families. It risks simplifying a very nuanced story into one of guilt or innocence when the reality is far messier than that.
It seems like a common thread in the source material is this sense that the series perhaps unintentionally feeds into a narrative that ultimately hinders our understanding of the case rather than deepening it.
Right. And it circles back to the source's biggest critique of the series, that it focuses more on condemning the brothers than exploring the systemic failures that might have contributed to this tragedy. We're talking about potential flaws in the justice system, societal biases against male victims of abuse, and the media frenzy that often surrounds these kinds of high-profile cases.
And it makes you think, if this series had addressed these issues more directly, would we be left with this same feeling of unease, this lingering doubt about whether justice was truly served?
It's hard to say for sure, but the source seems to suggest that by focusing more on the spectacle of the trial and the brothers' perceived lack of remorse, the series reinforces a kind of indifference toward their fate.
And that's a chilling thought. Because if we as viewers, and perhaps even as a society, become indifferent to the potential suffering of individuals caught in a flawed system, what does that say about us?
It's a question worth pondering for sure, because this case, like so many others, highlights the very human cost of our collective need for easy answers, for neat narratives that fit our preconceived notions of good and evil.
It's like we want to categorize people, especially in cases like this, as either monsters or victims, when the reality is often much more complicated. It feels like, I don't know, we're grappling with some really heavy stuff here. The nature of truth, the complexities of abuse, and this underlying sense that maybe, just maybe, the justice system didn't quite get it right.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack, and the source material definitely doesn't shy away from that. In fact, it ends on a rather provocative note, suggesting that the Menendez brothers case embodies a sort of societal indifference to the complexities of justice itself.
That's interesting because it's not just about whether they were guilty or innocent, right? It's about what happens when we, as a society, I guess, feel the need to like force a narrative onto a case that's anything but black and white.
Precisely. And the source material really drives this home by highlighting the, you know, just chaotic media circus that surrounded the trial. We're talking about cameras in the courtroom, salacious headlines, and a public seemingly obsessed with the brothers' every move. It makes you wonder how anyone, even a jury sequestered from the outside world, could truly remain objective in that kind of environment.
Yeah, and that takes us back to the source's initial point about truth being subjective, especially in these, high-profile cases. With so many conflicting accounts, so much, I guess, media manipulation, it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction.
It's a cautionary tale, really. The Menendez brothers' case serves as a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice isn't always neat or straightforward. It's messy, it's emotionally charged, and it often forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we rely on.
And sometimes, as the source seems to suggest, it leaves us with more questions than answers.
Which, in a way, might be the most important takeaway of all. Because when we allow ourselves to sit with the discomfort of unanswered questions, to challenge our own assumptions and biases, we open ourselves up to a deeper understanding of the world around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Menendez brothers case, I'm left with this lingering feeling of, I don't know, maybe a sense of responsibility. Like, it's not enough to just consume these stories to get caught up in the drama of it all. We have a duty to engage critically, to question the narratives we're presented with, and to consider the human cost of our kind of collective need for easy answers.
Beautifully put. And if this deep dive has sparked even a fraction of that critical thinking in you, our listener, then it's achieved its purpose. We always encourage you to seek out the source material, delve deeper into the nuances of this case, and come to your own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, the most important conversations are often the ones that stay with us long after the episode ends. The ones that make us question, reflect, and maybe even see the world a little differently.